Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. Well, folks, I went deep into the rabbit hole looking for monsters for you. Over the years, I have watched, seen, or heard of killers such as Gacy, Dahmer, Bundy, and more. All bad, of course. But how I have never heard of this monster is beyond me. A quick, terrifying side note before we get started. The man you're about to hear about was released and freed on $50 bail and is currently free right now. No one knows where he is, and no one knows if he is even alive. Pedro Alonso Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in Colombia in 1948 or 1949, according to records differing. At this time, this was in fact the last place on Earth anyone would have wanted to be born. The country was ruled by riots and unthinkable acts of violence. This continued for 10 years and took over 200,000 lives before it was over. The son of a penniless prostitute, Pedro was the 7th child of 13 children, and his early years would be described as anything but joyous. His mother was an overbearing woman who dominated her children with an ironclad fist. Regardless of his home life, anything was better than being out on the mean streets. Human rights violations by the guerrillas, paramilitaries, and members of the National Armed Forces were commonplace, and the country's crime rate was 50 times higher than all other countries in the world. At the age of 8, Pedro's mother caught him having sexual relations with his younger sister, and his worst nightmare became a reality. He was exiled to the streets and ordered to never return home again. As bleak as the situation appeared, things quickly began to look up when an older man picked him up off the streets and offered him food and a place to stay. Pedro could not believe his luck and quickly accepted the offer in blind faith. Nonetheless, it was in fact too good to be true. Instead of being taken to a plush home with food and bedding, the man took Pedro to an abandoned building where he sodomized him numerous times before tossing him out onto the cold hard streets. Following his misfortune with the older man, Pedro became terrified of strangers. He slept in alleyways and deserted buildings, and would only meander out at night in search of food from trash cans and local dumps. It was almost a year before Pedro finally built up the courage to travel about the country, and eventually ended up in the town of Bogota. After a few days of begging for food and scavenging dumpsters, a resident American couple approached him. The elder couple was distressed by Pedro's skeletal appearance and heartbroken watching him beg for food. They provided him with a warm meal and asked him to come live with them. With little other choices left, Pedro accepted their offer and went home with the couple. He was provided with free room and board and eventually enrolled in a day school for orphans. Regardless of Pedro's apparent good fortune, as with everything else in his life, it was not meant to be. In 1963, at the age of 12, a male teacher sexually molested him at his day school. All of Pedro's previous fears were reborn, and anger grew within him. Following the incident, he stole money from an office in the school and ran away from home. Pedro returned to the only safe place he knew, his first true home, the streets of Colombia. The country's civil war was becoming a thing of the past, and the Cold War was nearly over. The government was reorganizing, and factories which had been built during the Depression were slowly beginning to reopen. Nonetheless, Pedro had never been skilled in any trades and only held a minimal education. He spent the next 6 years of his life begging for food and committing petty thefts in order to survive. By his mid-teens, Pedro began stealing cars to support himself. He had little to lose, and local chop shops paid him well for his services. He was a very proficient car thief and was looked up to by younger apprentices of the trade. In spite of his skills, in 1969, 18-year-old Pedro was arrested by authorities for car theft and sentenced to serve 7 years in prison. He served just 2 days behind bars before being brutally gang-raped by 4 older inmates. Following this most recent attack, Pedro swore to himself that no one would ever touch him again. In retaliation, he fashioned a crude knife from prison utensils and spent the following 2 weeks getting his revenge by individually murdering each of the 4 men that had raped him. Authorities deemed the murder self-defense and simply added an additional 2 years to his initial sentence. Prison time, combined with his previous hardships, did irreparable damage to Pedro's mind and seemed to have pushed him over the edge of what little sanity he still held dear. Due to the mental abuse he endured at the hands of his mother during his early years, he had grown fearful of women. He found social intercourse with them impractical and fulfilled his desires through pornographic books and magazines. In Pedro's mind, his mother was to blame for all of his life's suffering and heartaches. Upon his release from prison in 1978, Pedro traveled widely throughout Peru. It was during this time that he later claimed to have begun stalking and killing at least 100 young girls from various Indian tribes throughout the region. While it is impossible to verify these claims, it is known that he was captured by a tribe in northern Peru while attempting to kidnap a 9-year-old girl. The Indians stripped and tortured Pedro for hours before deciding to bury him alive. Nonetheless, luck was apparently on his side because an American missionary intervened and convinced his captors that murder was ungodly and that they should turn Pedro over to the proper authorities. They reluctantly agreed and remanded their prisoner over to the Peruvian authorities. Not wanting to waste time investigating petty Indian complaints, the Peruvian government deported Pedro back to Ecuador. Following his return to Ecuador, Pedro began traveling extensively around the region, including frequent stops in Colombia. Authorities soon began to notice an increase in missing person cases involving young girls. However, they quickly concluded that they were due to the growing South American sex slave rings. In April of 1980, a flash flood near Ambato, Ecuador, caused authorities to take a second look at their missing person cases when the raging waters unearthed the remains of 4 missing children. While it was difficult for them to determine the causes of death, they concluded that the girls had obviously met foul play, since someone had taken pains to hide their bodies from prying eyes. Just days after the flash flood, a local resident, Carvina Pavida, was shopping at a local marketplace with her 12-year-old daughter Marie, when an unknown man attempted to abduct the young girl. Carvina cried out for help as the man tried to flee the market with her daughter in his arms. Local merchants quickly came to her aid, chased the man down before he could make his escape. They held him down as the authorities were summoned. Pedro was rambling incoherently when the police arrived at the scene. As they traveled back to headquarters with their suspect in tow, their initial conclusion was that they had a madman in custody. Once back at police headquarters, Pedro refused to cooperate with authorities and remained silent throughout their lines of questioning. Investigators soon realized that they would have to employ a different strategy in order to get their suspect to talk. One of the officers soon suggested that they dress up a local priest and place him in a cell with Pedro. The plan was for Father Guidino to win the suspect's confidence and get him to discuss his crime. It did not take long for Pedro to begin talking, and by the next day, he had revealed such repulsive acts of violence to the priest that he could hear no more and asked to be taken out of the cell. Following a brief interview with the father, investigators confronted Pedro with their newly acquired evidence, and he finally broke down. Police were initially skeptical of Pedro's grisly, almost incredible confessions, and liaisons with Peru and Colombia were unable to substantiate them. As Pedro realized that investigators doubted the truthfulness of his claims, he offered to lead them to several burial spots throughout the country. With little else that they could do, investigators agreed and put the plan into action. Just days after his initial confession, Pedro was taken from police headquarters in leg irons so that he could direct a police caravan to his various dump sites. The investigators' doubts soon began to vanish when Pedro led them to a secluded area in Ambato, where they discovered the remains of 53 girls aged 8 to 12. Throughout the day, Pedro led them to 28 other sites. However, no other bodies were discovered. Some of the investigators felt that animals had most likely scattered the remains, and floods had washed what little was left away. Upon arrival back at the police headquarters, Pedro was quickly charged with 57 counts of murder. However, Pedro saw the ante boosted to 110 as a result of his detailed confessions. The director of prison affairs, Victor Lascano, later explained, "If someone confesses to 53 you find, and hundreds more, you tend to believe what he says." Lascano also told reporters that, "I think his estimate of 300 is very low." There was only one person ever granted permission to interview Lopez. The following is from that interview given by Ron Leitner in 1981. Meeting the world's worst modern serial killer required preparation. Pedro Lopez was held in the center of an otherwise abandoned section of Ambato prison, on top of a mountain, far from other prisoners, for their safety and his. There was an unofficial reward, believed to be raised by the families of his victims, of $25,000 for any guard or prisoner who killed him. I was searched for weapons as I went through 3 levels of security. Taking off my shoes, I tiptoed down the corridor and peeked over the edge of the small barred window into his cell. The monster of the Andes, as he was known, was on the floor, sitting against a wall, huge hands flexing. On the wall behind him were faded clippings of his mass murder trial. I sat on the other side of the corridor, turned on my flash and pre-focused my camera on the barred window. Somewhere down the corridor behind me, a guard made a hissing sound. The guards liked to torment the serial killer who feared they would kill him. The monster stirred. He growled and ran at the window, grabbing the bars and snarling. That's when I captured the picture showing his rage and powerful killing hands. The next day I returned with the warden, while guards with cocked pistols watched through the little window and from the larger entrance to his cell, in which he had been kept for 12 years in solitary confinement. I stepped into the cell. From outside the bars, the prison director, Victor Lascano, introduced me, and I foolishly and innocently held up my hand for the monster to shake. He was surprised. Probably no one had ever touched him since he was locked away in 1980, following a 3-year killing rampage. He stared into my eyes, then gripped my hand and began squeezing. His enormous hand, which had exerted so much pressure on young girls' necks that may have had their eyes popped out by pressure, now turned its power on me. My hand went numb. If I'd been wearing a ring, my fingers would have broken. Instead, the ends of my fingers began to swell up like tiny red balloons, gorged with blood. I was about to scream out when the monster suddenly stopped and smiled. That's when he decided to grant me the one and only interview he ever made. He now invited the director of the prison in with me, but only if the director's pretty daughter, who was acting as interpreter, came in also. He told the warden he had not touched a woman in 12 years. He would go forward with the interview, but only if he could touch the hands of the warden's daughter. Everyone gasped. We 3 were now in the cell with the monster. Guards aimed pistols through the bars. If there was shooting, I hoped I wouldn't be shot. Then the brave girl held out her hands, and the monster of the Andes very carefully touched the ends of his fingers to her wrists. Would he grab her by the throat and kill her? The moment passed. He released her and began talking. He later told us that at her age of 26, she was too old to attract him. With pistols aimed at him continuously so he wouldn't suddenly strangle any of us, the monster of the Andes answered every question. Questions no serial killer had ever answered before. What is it like to kill? Why kill at all? And why such young girls? Just as other men shave, shower, and eat, Lopez killed on a regular basis, slaying 2, sometimes 3 girls every week, every month, every year, over a 3-year-long murder rampage. This next part are the responses that Lopez gave to Leitner. This is extremely graphic and extremely disturbing. You've been warned. I am a man of the century. No one will ever forget me. I went after my victims by walking among the markets, searching for a girl with a certain look on her face, a look of innocence and beauty. She would be a good girl, working with her mother. I followed them sometimes for 2 or 3 days, waiting for when she was left alone. I would give her a trinket like a hand mirror, then take her to the edge of town, where I would promise a trinket for her mother. I would take her to a secret hideaway, where prepared graves awaited. Sometimes there were bodies of earlier victims there. I cuddled them, and then raped them at sunrise. At the first sign of light, I would get excited. I forced the girl into sex and put my hands around her throat. When the sun rose, I would strangle her. It was only good if I could see her eyes. It would have been wasted in the dark. I had to watch them by daylight. There is a divine moment when I have my hands around a young girl's throat. I look into her eyes and see a certain light, a spark, suddenly go out. The moment of death is enthralling and exciting. Only those who actually kill know what I mean. When I am released, I will feel that moment again. It took the girls 5 to 15 minutes to die. I was very considerate. I would spend a long time with them making sure they were dead. I would check whether they were still breathing, and sometimes I had to kill them all over again. They never screamed, because they didn't expect anything would happen. They were innocent. My little friends liked to have company. I often put 3 or 4 into one hole, but after a while, I got bored because I couldn't move. So I looked for more girls. Leitner also said, "Ever since that interview, I keep hearing the voice of the world's most deadly serial killer laughing. I will soon be a free man again. They are releasing me on good behavior in 1998 or 1999. Lopez was sentenced to 16 years in prison in Ecuador in 1981, released in August in 1994, re-arrested an hour later as an illegal immigrant and handed over to Colombian authorities who charged him with a 20-year-old murder. He was found to be insane and was held in a psychiatric wing of a Bogota hospital. After 4 years, he was declared sane and released on $50 bail. No one knows if he is alive or dead. He won't live long," predicted the tough mother of Maria Poveda, the young Ecuadorian girl who helped his capture. "It'll be a kindness to the world for someone to murder this fiend." Police believed it likely that many fathers and brothers of murdered little girls would go after the monster of Andes. Perhaps the monster of the Andes was finally murdered by someone who felt they were doing humanity a service. I personally couldn't agree more. Monsters walk among us every day, and most of them do not boast a title or wear a sign warning us of their presence. Should this mean that you live in fear? Of course not. However, you should be alert, aware, know where your children are, and who the people are that they spend their time with outside of your home. Enjoy the world we live in, but with an empowered education of the dangers that lurk when and where you least expect it. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please contact me through any of my social media links or leave a comment here. See you next time. Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. You know, I have read some disgusting things in this little journey we have taken together, and I thought it would get less gross, less disgusting, but it doesn't. Maybe that's because I try to put myself in the shoes of the victims, try to imagine the terror they felt, or the families having to hear the news, or worse, never having closure of knowing what happened or where their family members went. Robert William Pickton, aka Willie. He was convicted of killing only 6. He later confessed to 49, but the police believe the real number is closer to 144 or worse. There was later speculation whether one person could commit so many atrocities. And as we have learned here together, yes, one person can be a real monster who goes on killing undetected for years, even decades. In 1905, the great-grandfather of the serial killer bought land near a mental hospital. William Picton raised hogs. His children grew up and raised hogs. His children's children grew up and raised hogs, all on the very same farm. Then in the late 1950s, the Pictons were forced to sell their farm and move. They had to make way for a new highway. In 1963, Willie's parents bought 40 acres of swamp for $18,000, towed their blue and white farmhouse to the site, and began raising children and pigs. They had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter went off to boarding school in the city and never returned to the farm, while the boys remained. The boys' father died in 1978, and their mother followed in 1979. The boys, now in their late 20s, inherited the farm with their sister. In 1994, the Pictons struck it rich. Their farmland that was purchased for $18,000 in 1963 was now worth $300,000 in 1993. By 1994, it was valued at $7.2 million. In the fall of '94, they sold part of their farm for $1.7 million to a townhouse development company. That same year, the city also bought a chunk of their land for $1.2 million and turned it into a park. Then in '95, the school district bought a piece of the pig farm for $2.3 million and built an elementary school on the site. It was around this time, when the Pictons became millionaires, that the women began going missing in alarming numbers from the DES. In 1995, Catherine Gonzalez went missing. A few months later, Catherine Knight. Then Dorothy Spence, Diana Melnick, Tanya Hollick, Olivia Williams, Frances Young, Stephanie Lane, Helen Hallmark, Janet Henry. The count didn't cease until 2001. According to Lincoln Clarks, a photographer who took pictures of 5 of the victims' remains, after making his small fortune, David Picton left the family farm and moved a mile or less down the road to a new property, where he opened a party hall called Piggy's Palace in 1996. Robert Picton now had the resources and the freedom to do as he pleased. A longshoreman who asked not to be named went with an old friend to a Halloween party at Piggy's Palace. He described the night in these hellish terms. I arrived at the party about 9 p.m. It was dark and rainy and muddy, and there were lots of motorcycles, old cars, and a big pig roasting on a spit. There were kids in costumes, some dressed as witches. These little kids were running around and playing in the dark. There wasn't much light. There were lots of women who looked like hookers. The party spilled all over the grounds, and there were people in the house and in the trailer doing the wild thing. I recall walking by a shack with a 40-watt bulb hanging over the door and machinery running inside. Here I got the death chill. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my feet froze to the ground. I didn't want to be there anymore, so I left and walked home. The account is by no means exceptional. Many who visited Piggy's Palace had similar impressions. It was wild, people were doing drugs and eating roasted pig. I was about to eat the pig, but when I saw Robert Pickton tearing apart the pig with his hands, I decided not to. His hands were dirty. Another unnamed woman said I went once, and I'd never go again. It was raunchy, lots of cocaine, lots of really, really badass people. I did not want to be a part of it. Piggy's Palace, however, had a double life. Records posted on crimelibrary.com show that Piggy's Palace was a non-profit society dedicated to raising money for sports organizations and other worthy groups, and as such, was visited by all kinds of people. 2 mayors, city council members, local business and civic leaders, ice hockey moms, high school and elementary school students. They all came for functions, dances, concerts, and other recreations at Piggy's Palace. Thousands of people had been to the palace and had enjoyed roasted pork. When questioned, they didn't want to believe that the pigs were the ones consuming the victims. It's common knowledge that Robert Pickton was, by the mid-90s, no longer a serious commercial pig farmer. He was a wealthy man. Raising hogs now was more of a hobby. He bought the pigs, fattened them, and sold the meat to friends, or roasted them for the bikers, prostitutes, mayors, and little leaguers who partied at Piggy's Palace. The entire city, population 53,000, it seemed, was feeding on the pigs that had been fed by the suspected serial killer, Robert Pickton. It wasn't just the guests of Piggy's Palace who consumed Pickton's pigs. The unusable remains of the pigs, entrails, brains, bones, nerve tissue, and gore, were taken by truck to a rendering plant near the DES called West Coast Reduction. Many are certain that the partial remains of the murdered sex workers were mixed within. The West Coast Reduction's facility is impressive. It's a complex of huge cylindrical cookers, storage tanks, office buildings, industrial stacks, and railroad tracks. Underground pipelines connect it with one of the biggest ports on the Pacific Rim. Huge orange cranes loom just behind it, and the surrounding air is relatively clean, although once in a while the smell of something awful wafts from an unidentifiable source. The plant turns animal bones, guts, fish, blood, pig entrails, used restaurant grease, and now, many believe, the remains of sex workers into a number of consumer products like lipstick base, soaps, shampoos, and perfumes. These commodities that improve human appearance are shipped all over the world. 6 blocks from the rendering plant, the most fashionable part of Vancouver begins. Commercial Drive is lined with restaurants that serve Cuban finger foods, theaters that screen Bollywood films, and stores that sell Italian shoes. People visit a wild variety of trendy cafes, tapas bars, spas, health food groceries, and cosmetic shops. All of these urban pleasures are walking distance from the rendering plant, the place where Pickton brought the intestines of his slaughtered hogs for more than 20 years. It is believed that Pickton would drive the intestines there, empty his truck, and then proceed to pick up sex workers, sometimes within a block of the plant. Vancouver residents have recently learned that fragments of some of these dead women's bodies may have entered the food chain through the rendering plant. As well as beauty products, rendering plants also make food for farm animals that humans consume. The regional director of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency said the following: "We made inquiries after learning that Robert Pickton had met the women he is accused of killing on his trips to the rendering plant. Any testing that would have been done at the plant would be around surveillance for chemical residues. I can't imagine any testing that would distinguish one animal matter from another." Pickton liked to hang out in the seediest hotels, the most notorious of which the Roosevelt and the Astoria Hotel. Robert Pickton's girlfriend, who for 18 months lived on the death farm. She is reported to be a junkie, half sensible, and now infamous for having arranged fatal farm visits for several women who were staying at the Roosevelt Hotel. One of whom was Andrea Josbury, who lived in room 201 and disappeared in June of 2001, whose remains were found on the farm the following year. The Astoria bartender, when asked about Pickton, said, "That faker, he used to sit right over there," the bartender said, pointing to an empty table. "He sat there all the time by himself. He was a wannabe, you know, he wanted to be a biker, a Hell's Angel, a mean leather guy. But everyone knew he was a weasel, a wannabe." The bartender claims he wasn't surprised when he heard Pickton was a serial killer. He said, "I can't imagine hanging out with a guy like that without something bad happening." Across the street from the pig farm is a makeshift memorial next to the Costco. In front of a white tent, there is an odd garden of old and new flowers, snapshots and news photos, short poems, and what appear to be personal items like teddy bears, left by friends and relatives of the murdered women. The police and scientists still occupy the farm, still searching for remains, still exit its gates to visit the Starbucks at the mall. Eventually, the investigation will end, the police tape will come down, and the scientists will depart. What will happen to Canada's most notorious pig farm then? It has been suggested that they build a real memorial park out of respect, and hopefully they will. In the meantime, the world goes on, using products that may or may not contain the remains of victims of Canada's most notorious serial killer. As this video comes to a close, in the credits, you will see a list of the known victims of Pickton, and it is literally the least I could do. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please email me at duchessdark676@gmail.com. See you next time. Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. Today is a special edition because the serial killer we are featuring today was released back into society. William Huff was 16 in 1967 when he brutally raped, murdered, and mutilated two girls, 7-year-old Cindy Cleland and 6-year-old Janelle Haynes. On April 7th, 2017, an email was sent to the producers of an Arizona news station. The subject line read, "I have information regarding the Arizona Board of Executive Clemency, Parole, releasing a serial killer into the community." 6 days later, the news station went to interview the woman who sent the email, to listen to the story of how a serial killer, who referred to himself as the Phantom, murdered 2 young girls and targeted a 3rd, and how this person would be let out of prison and allowed to live in an unsuspecting Tucson neighborhood. In 1967, in the town of Sierra Vista, population was 5,000. Most of the residents were there because of the adjacent army post, Fort Huachuca. Sierra Vista at that time did not have a violent crime problem, said David Santor, who was 22 years old back then, and has a vivid recollection of the events of that spring and summer. Events that could change the community in ways that only fear and tragedy can. The element of universal trust was gone, said Santor. On April 30th, 1967, 7-year-old Cindy Cleland walked down the street, looking for bottles that she could turn in at the neighborhood store in exchange for candy. 3 days later, a search team found her naked, lifeless, mutilated body in the desert, 120 feet into the boundary of Fort Huachuca. Throughout the 3 days she was missing, they would find clothing and underpants and bring it to my mother and ask, "Is this Cindy's?" said Darlene, who was Cindy's older sister. She also remembers how her father was a sergeant in the army at the time and deployed overseas. The Red Cross had to track him down in Vietnam, brought him back while the military was looking for Cindy. And on the 3rd day, when my dad happened to arrive, was the same day they found Cindy. Having discovered Cindy's body, FBI agents, Army investigators, and the county sheriff's deputies and Sierra Vista police turned their attention toward finding the killer. 1 week later, a handwritten letter arrived at Sierra Vista Police Headquarters. It contained a message that read in part, "I am the Phantom. You have found my first victim. My next victim lives on Stephen Street, 9 years old. Fools." Now keep in mind that Huff was 16 when he wrote this and deemed himself the Phantom. Police identified the 9-year-old girl mentioned in the letter and provided round-the-clock protection for her. The letter would become a key piece of evidence. Meantime, the residents of Sierra Vista were living in fear. People went out and bought guns. People did everything they could to make sure they knew where their children were every minute of the day, said Santor. Investigators followed lead after lead into dead end after dead end. All the while, the Sierra Vista police chief suspected a neighborhood teenager had something to do with the crime. On June 22nd, another little girl vanished. Janelle Haynes was 6 years old. Her family had just moved back to Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca after being stationed in Germany. Around 11 a.m., Janelle was playing at the pond near their Lakeside Officers Club. Her brother said that she had been talking to a tall, thin, black teenage boy when she disappeared. At around 1 p.m., before he knew about the second abduction, the chief of police was driving onto the army post for a meeting. He said he noticed that the neighborhood teenager he suspected of being involved in Cindy Clayland's disappearance was walking off the post. Search teams found Janelle's body later that day. She was naked, murdered in a similar fashion as Cindy Clayland, but now investigators had a solid lead. The description Janelle's brother gave to the investigators matched William Huff, the teenager the chief also suspected all along. Huff had a history of run-ins with law enforcement and admitted to killing a ringtail cat on the army post. Huff was suspected of killing several cats, stealing bikes, and breaking into his neighbors' homes. Huff was charged in the death of Cindy Clayland and Janelle Haynes. On the day the first of his 2 trials were scheduled to begin, Huff pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for one murder and 40 years to life for the other. That was supposed to be the end of the story. Melissa Haynes, who would be the niece of slain Janelle Haynes, was explaining why she became the family member who spoke at William Huff's parole hearings. Somebody needed to keep an eye on him. Someone needed to know where he was, what he was doing, to keep the community safe. Huff became eligible for parole in 2008, and records show that every time he appeared before the Arizona Board of Executive Clemency, his request for parole was denied. But that changed on December 2nd, 2015. We believe that it was going to be the exact same thing as always, said Haynes. She and Darlene Roy, who is Cindy Clayland's older sister, had become friends through their efforts to keep Huff behind bars for the rest of his life. He was the victim always. Cindy and Janelle were never the victims. He was the victim, said Roy. He was the victim of the police department, the victim of alcohol, the victim of drugs. Here are 3 excerpts from the Clemency Board hearing that took place in December of 2015. I have no plans to go out and violate any law. I know what I did, and I understand the implications of it, Huff said. A Clemency Board member also stated, as time goes on and on, it makes it more difficult to keep an old lifer in prison for life, especially one that was a teenager at the time he committed the offense. Another board member stated, having a psychopathic personality does not mean you're going to be a criminal and continue to commit crimes. I'm going to make a motion to grant home arrest to Mr. Huff. The Clemency Board voted unanimously that day to grant William Huff release on home arrest. It was almost a feeling like I was at the wrong parole hearing, said Haynes. Huff was released to a halfway house in Tucson in January of 2016. The victims' families believe the Clemency Board made a huge mistake. So does David Santor, who joined the Sierra Vista Police Department in 1968 and would later become its chief. When asked if he considers Huff a serial killer, Santor's response was immediate. Absolutely, he said. He fits the mold right down to the last dot. Dr. Stephen Pitt, a nationally known and respected forensic psychiatrist, and has worked on high-profile murder cases across the country, who is also a consultant to the Phoenix Police Department, was asked, is this person someone who we are deeply concerned about? His answer, absolutely. Does that mean this person is going to go out and reoffend? I have no way of knowing that, said Pitt, who has not personally interviewed Huff or examined the detailed case information. But Dr. Pitt did say the very nature of the offenses raises a number of red flags. He abducted and murdered young girls, and the offenses appeared to be sexually sadistic in nature. A recording of a clemency board hearing on April 6th shows newer board members also had reservations about Huff being out of prison. In my view, after reading all the evidence in the file, he should never have been put on home arrest. If it's at all possible, my view is to revoke his home arrest and send him back to prison. He is a danger to the community. But after a discussion with attorneys from the Arizona Attorney General's office during executive session, the board voted to keep Huff on home arrest. That crime was committed 50 years ago, said C.T. Wright, Ph.D., who is the current chair of the Arizona Board of Executive Clemency. The parole officer indicated to this board that he was one of their best inmates that he'd worked with. Dr. Wright and Ellen Kirschbaum, who was the chair of the board when it voted to release Huff, said they looked at the nature of the offense, Huff's criminal history, and clean record while in prison, as well as the statements of the victims' families. It's a decision I made being on the board at the time. I stand by all my decisions, said Kirschbaum. When asked whether she could say that Huff was no longer a danger to the community, here was her response. I don't think I can answer that question, she said. Dr. Wright also said, I can't answer that question. The only thing I would say to you, sir, is that for a year and a half he has proven that he has not committed another crime. The producer of the local Arizona news station spent 2 days sitting in a car in front of the halfway house where Huff is living. He videotaped Huff walking around the grounds of the facility, walking out to the street to get his mail, riding his bike around the neighborhood. He then approached him to see if he would sit down for an interview. Here is part of the conversation. You understand why people are nervous about you being out of prison? The reporter asked. Yeah, because of my case and the stuff that happened to me, Huff said. You mean the stuff that you did? The reporter said. Yeah, Huff replied. He said he would consider doing an interview, but less than an hour later, stated in a text that he was advised not to speak to the media. All the while, neighborhood children walked back and forth in front of Huff's address, completely unaware of who was living there. It turns out, there are no restrictions placed on him regarding contact with children. That is something that the state is reevaluating. Now imagine for a moment, it was your daughter, your sister, your friend that had been murdered. How would you feel about this? What about an ordinary citizen that you don't know at all? Should it not anger you? The problem with the logic of this clemency board is the fact that a pedophile cannot be rehabilitated. This is a fact and should be considered when laws that are supposed to protect children fail them and society as a whole. Telling a pedophile not to like children in that way is the same as telling a dog you're a cat now. Be a cat. They can't. It will not happen. It is not within their control to change it. And releasing these criminals creates a chain of events and future crimes that could have been completely avoided. Will he kill again? I guess only time will tell. As in prison, he had no access to children. But it seems to be a social experiment that is a ticking time bomb. You can help change laws. People are not powerless, but you have to act, you have to speak up. Contacting your state's congressman and telling them that you want to see criminals that create such heinous acts to stay behind bars is a start. I have left a link in the description box that gives you a list of every congressman in the United States. And for the future of our nation, I hope it is utilized. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please contact me through any of my social media links or email me at duchessdark676@gmail.com. See you next time. Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. In the short life of this series, I have seen the atrocities of mankind, ranging from centuries ago to as recent as just a few months. Sadly, the making of monsters doesn't seem to have an end in sight. What sets today's superstar apart would be the great lengths he went to prepare and secure the deaths of countless. Although he confessed to killing 27, only 9 were ever confirmed. However, it is believed that the real number is well over 250, due to the witness accounts of so many entering but never leaving. H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire, the son of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price. The family was descended from among the first settlers to the area. He grew up with a father who was a strict disciplinarian and was often bullied as a child. He claimed that, as a child, he had been forced by other students to view and touch a human skeleton after they found out about his fear of the doctor. The bullies had initially brought him there to scare him, but instead, he was fascinated. Herman graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1884. While enrolled, he stole bodies from the school laboratory, disfiguring the corpses and claiming that the people had been accidentally killed. Mudgett then collected insurance money from policies which he had taken out on each one. After graduating, he moved to Chicago to practice pharmacy. He also began to engage in a number of shady businesses, real estate, promotional deals, all under the name of H. Holmes. On July 8, 1878, Holmes married Clara Lovering of Alton, New Hampshire. He also married Myrta Belknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota on January 28, 1887, making him a bigamist. He had a daughter with Belknap named Lucy Theodate Holmes, born on July 4th in 1889 in Illinois. The family of 3 resided in the upscale Chicago suburb of Wilmette. Although Holmes spent most of his time in the city tending to business, Holmes filed a petition for divorce from his first wife after marrying his second, but it was never finalized. He married his third wife, Georgiana Yoke, on January 9th, 1894. He also had a relationship with Julia Smythe, the wife of Ned Connor, a one-time employee who later fled Chicago. Julia became one of Holmes' victims. While in Chicago, Holmes came across Dr. E.S. Holton's drugstore. It was located at the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street, in the neighborhood of Inglewood. Holton was suffering from cancer while his wife minded the store. Through his charm, Holmes got a job there and then manipulated her into letting him purchase the store. The agreement was that she could still live in the upstairs apartment even after Holton died. Once he did, Holmes murdered Mrs. Holton and told people she was visiting relatives in California. As people started asking questions as to when she would be coming back, he elaborated the lie and told them that she loved it so much in California that she decided to stay. Holmes purchased a lot across the street from the drugstore, where he built his 3-story block-long castle, as it was dubbed by those in the neighborhood. It was opened as a hotel for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, with part of the structure used as commercial space. The ground floor of the castle contained, aside from Holmes' own relocated drugstore, various shops, a jeweler, for example, while the upper 2 floors contained his personal office, as well as a maze of over 100 windowless rooms with doorways that would open to brick walls, oddly angled hallways, stairways to nowhere, doors that could only be opened from the outside, and a host of other strange and labyrinthine constructions. Holmes had repeatedly changed builders during the initial construction of the castle to ensure that he only fully understood the design of the house, thereby decreasing the chances of any of them reporting it to the police. Over a period of 3 years, Holmes selected female victims from among his employees, many of whom were required as a condition of employment to take out life insurance policies, for which Holmes would pay the premiums, but also be the beneficiary. He would then proceed to torture and kill them. Some were locked in soundproof bedrooms fitted with glass lines. That permitted him to asphyxiate them at any time. Some victims were locked in a huge bank vault near his office. He could sit and listen as they screamed, panicked, and eventually suffocated due to the fact that the vault was soundproof. The victims' bodies went by a secret chute to the basement, where some were meticulously dissected, stripped of flesh, crafted into skeleton models, and then sold to medical schools. Some of the bodies were cremated or placed in lime pits for destruction. Holmes also had 2 giant furnaces, as well as pits of acid, bottles of various poisons, and even a stretching rack. Through the connections he had gained in medical school, he was able to sell skeletons and organs with little difficulty. Holmes picked one of the most remote rooms in the castle to perform hundreds of illegal abortions. Some of his patients died as a result, and their corpses were also processed and the skeletons sold. Following the World's Fair, with creditors closing in and the economy in a general slump, Holmes left Chicago. He next appeared in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had inherited property from 2 railroad heiress sisters, one of whom he promised marriage and both of whom he murdered. There, he sought to construct another castle along the lines of his Chicago operation. However, he soon abandoned this project as well, finding the law enforcement climate in Texas inhospitable. He continued to move about the United States and Canada, and while it seems likely that he continued to kill, the only bodies discovered which date from this period are those of his close business associate and 3 of the associate's children. In July of 1894, Holmes was arrested and briefly incarcerated for the first time for a horse swindle that ended in St. Louis. He was promptly bailed out, but while in jail, he struck up a conversation with a convicted train robber named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to bilk an insurance company out of $20,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his own death. Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. He was directed to Colonel Jephthah Howe, the brother of a public defender, and Howe found Holmes' plan to be brilliant. Holmes' plan to fake his own death failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press his claim. Instead, he concocted a similar plan with his associate, Pitezel. Pitezel had agreed to fake his own death so that his wife could collect on the $10,000 policy, which she was to split with Holmes and a shady attorney, Howe. The scheme was to take place in Philadelphia. Pitezel was to be an inventor under the name B.F. Perry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pitezel. Holmes then killed Pitezel, although some have argued that Pitezel, an alcoholic and chronic depressive, might in fact have committed suicide. Forensic evidence presented at Holmes' later trial, however, showed that chloroform was administered after Pitezel's death, presumably to fake suicide. Holmes proceeded to collect on the policy on the basis of the genuine Pitezel corpse. Holmes then went on to manipulate Pitezel's wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children to stay in his custody. The eldest and baby remained with Mrs. Pitezel. He traveled with the children through northern United States and into Canada. Simultaneously, he escorted Mrs. Pitezel along a parallel route, all the while using various aliases and lying to Mrs. Pitezel concerning her husband's death, claiming that he was hiding in South America, as well as lying to her about the true whereabouts of her other children. They were often only separated by a few blocks. A Philadelphia detective had tracked Holmes, finding the decomposed bodies of 2 of the Pitezel children in Toronto. He then followed Holmes to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a cottage. He was reported to have visited a local pharmacy to purchase the drugs he used to kill the remaining Pitezel child that was in his care, and a repair shop to sharpen the knives he used to chop up the body before he burned it. The boy's teeth and bits of bone were discovered in the Holmes chimney. In 1894, the police were tipped off by his former cellmate, Marion Hedgepeth, who Holmes had neglected to pay off as promised for his help in providing Howe. Holmes' escapade ended when he was finally arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, after being tracked there from Philadelphia by the Pinkertons. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas, as the authorities had little more than suspicion at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting third wife. After the custodian for the castle informed police that he was never allowed to clean the upper floors, police began a thorough investigation over the course of the next month, uncovering Holmes' efficient methods of committing murders and then disposing of the corpses. A fire of mysterious origin consumed the building on August 19, 1895, and the site is currently occupied by a U.S. Post Office building. The number of his victims has typically been estimated between 20 and 100, and even as high as 250, based upon missing persons reports of the time, as well as the testimony of Holmes' neighbors, who reported seeing him accompany unidentified young women into his hotel. Young women whom they never saw leaving. The discrepancy in numbers can perhaps be best attributed to the fact that a great many people came to Chicago to see the World's Fair, but for one reason or another, never came home. The only verified number is 27, although police had commented that some of the bodies in the basement were so badly dismembered and decomposed that it was difficult to tell how many bodies were actually there. Holmes' victims were primarily women and primarily blonde, but included some men and children. While Holmes sat in prison in Philadelphia, not only did the Chicago police investigate his operations in that city, but the Philadelphia police began to try to unravel the whole Pitezel situation. In particular, what had happened to the 3 missing children. Philadelphia Detective Frank Geyer was given the task of finding out. His quest for the children, like the search of Holmes' castle, received wide publicity. His eventual discovery of their remains essentially sealed Holmes' fate, at least in the public's mind. Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Pitezel and confessed, following his conviction, to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, and 6 attempted murders. Holmes was paid $7,500 by Hearst's papers in exchange for his confession. He gave various contradictory accounts of his life, initially claiming innocence, and later that he was possessed by Satan. His facility for lying has made it difficult for researchers to ascertain any truth on the basis of his statements. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison, also known as the Philadelphia County Prison. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Holmes' neck did not snap immediately. Instead, he died slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes, before being pronounced dead at 20 minutes after the trap was sprung. He requested that he be buried in concrete so that no one could ever dig him up and dissect his body, as he had dissected so many before him. This request was granted. On New Year's Eve 1910, Marion Hedgepeth, who had been pardoned for informing on Holmes, was shot and killed by a police officer during a holdup at a Chicago saloon. On March 7th, 1914, a story in the Chicago Tribune reported the death of the former caretaker of the murder castle, Pat Quinlan. Quinlan had committed suicide by taking strychnine, and the paper reported that his death meant the mystery of the Holmes castle would remain unexplained. Quinlan's surviving relatives claimed that he had been haunted for several months before his death, and that he could never sleep. Many monsters have come and gone, but few throughout history have purposely made entrapments for their victims like Holmes did, and I pray that they never do. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please contact me through any of my social media links or email me at duchessdark676@gmail.com. See you next time. This series has been so requested that you know what? Today, you get 2. Let's do this. Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. It's been a minute, hasn't it? So I thought we'd start out with a doozy. Carl Panzram, aka Jefferson Rhodes, Jeff Davis, Jeff Baldwin, Carl Baldwin, Jack Allen, John King, and John O'Leary, was an American serial killer and robber whose crimes took place between 1920 and 1929, claiming to have killed only 22 victims. Victims' profiles were boys and men, whom he sodomized, shot, strangled, and beat with a rock or iron bar. He was born Charles Panzram in Minnesota, the son of Prussian immigrants Johann, John, and Matilda Panzram, and raised on his family's farm. By his teens, he was an alcoholic and was repeatedly in trouble with the authorities, usually for burglary and theft. He ran away from home at the age of 14 and claimed to have been gang raped by a group of hobos. On other accounts, it is claimed that he began a lifelong odyssey of crime and murder at the age of 8. By the time he was 11, his family had sent him off to a reform school as part of a plea bargain on a burglary charge. Repeatedly sodomized and physically tortured during his 2 years at the juvenile home, his emotional problems grew progressively worse, and as a teenager, he enjoyed setting fires so he could watch buildings burn, and often fantasized about committing mass murder. In adulthood, Panzram was a prolific thief, and he was frequently caught and imprisoned. While incarcerated, Panzram frequently got into trouble by attacking guards and refusing to follow their orders. The guards retaliated, subjecting him to beatings and punishments. Panzram served a jail sentence from 1908 to 1910 at Leavenworth for larceny, shortly after enlisting in the Army in 1907. William Howard Taft was then Secretary of War and approved the sentence. In August 1920, Panzram burglarized Taft's New Haven home, stealing a large amount of jewelry and bonds, as well as Taft's .45 caliber handgun, which Panzram then used in several murders. In his autobiography, Panzram wrote that he was rage personified, and he would often rape men whom he robbed, not necessarily because he was homosexual, because it was his method of dominating and humiliating people. He also engaged in vandalism and arson, at one point considering an ambitious plot to scuttle a British warship docked in New York Harbor in order to provoke a war between Britain and the United States. By his own admission, one of the few times he did not engage in criminal activities was when he was employed as a strikebreaker against union employees. On another occasion, he tried to sign aboard as a ship's steward on a U.S. Army transport vessel, but was discharged when he reported to work intoxicated. He served time in jails and prisons in California, Texas, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Connecticut, New York, in Sing Sing and Clinton, Washington, and Leavenworth, as previously mentioned. On June 1st, 1915, Panzram committed his first known crime by burglarizing a house in Astoria, and was arrested soon after while attempting to sell some of the stolen items. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, to be served in the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, where he arrived on June 24th. Upon arrival, he became inmate number 7390 and was under the supervision of Warden Harry Minto, who believed in harsh treatment of inmates, which included beatings and isolation, among other disciplinary measures. Later, Panzram stated that he swore he would never do that 7 years, and I defied the warden and all his officers to make me. Panzram was disciplined several times while incarcerated, including 61 days in solitary confinement, before escaping on September 18, 1917. Earlier, he helped Otto Hooker escape from the prison, and Hooker killed Minto while evading capture. While on the lam, Panzram was involved in 2 shootouts before returning to the prison. On May 12, 1918, he sawed through the prison bars and escaped again. This time, he avoided capture and caught a freight train heading east. He never returned to the Northwest, changed his name to John O'Leary, and shaved off his mustache. In 1920, Panzram committed his first murders. He lured sailors in New York away from bars, got them drunk, raped and shot them, and dumped their remains into the river. He claimed to have killed 10 in all. He was stopped only when the vessel he was in was shipwrecked near Atlantic City. His last 2 potential victims escaped to parts unknown. Panzram then went to Luanda, Angola, where he claims to have raped and killed an 11 or 12-year-old boy. In his confession to this murder, he wrote, he joyfully recalled the killing, stating that his brains were coming out of his ears when I left him. I'm not sorry. My conscience doesn't bother me. I sleep sound and have sweet dreams. He also claimed that he hired a rowing boat, shot the rowers, and threw their bodies to the crocodiles. Once back in America, Panzram claimed he shot a man dead for trying to rob him. He also asserted that he raped and killed 2 small boys, beating the former to death with a rock on July 18, 1922, in Salem, Massachusetts, and strangling the other later that year in New Haven, Connecticut. After his last arrest in 1928, he also claimed to have committed a murder while burglarizing homes between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and a 1928 murder in Philadelphia. 3 of these last 5 killings are confirmed. With the death of the Oregon prison warden, Panzram was involved in at least 1 murder as an accessory before the fact, prior to 1920. In 1928, Panzram was arrested for burglary and held in Washington, D.C. During his interrogation and jail time, he voluntarily confessed to killing 2 boys. At this time, he was befriended by a young prison guard named Henry Lesser. Lesser gave Panzram some writing materials, which the prisoner used to write his autobiography, detailing his crimes. A quote from this: "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." In light of his extensive criminal record, he was handed a 25-year sentence, which was to be served at Leavenworth. "I'll kill the first man that bothers me," Panzram told the warden. On June 20th, 1929, he killed Robert Wark, foreman of the prison laundry in Leavenworth, battering him to death with an iron bar. Pans Ram was then sentenced to death. He refused to appeal, even threatening to kill human rights groups that attempted to appeal on his behalf. Pans Ram was hanged on September 5th, 1930. When they put the noose around his neck, he allegedly spat in his executioner's face and declared, "I wish all mankind had one neck so I could choke it." When asked by the executioner if he had any last words, Pans Ram barked, "Yes. Hurry it up, you hoser bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." While we are given a peek into his adolescent years, there are no records of his early life, cluing us in on exactly what created this monster. But the few details we do have seem harsh enough. If Pans Ram had never been sent away to the boys' home in his early teens, would it have prevented his metamorphosis? Although there is no way to know this now, we have learned through this series that violence breeds violence. And if we can break the cycle, we save ourselves and society as a whole. Here we go again. What's worse than a sodomizing serial killer who had no remorse for his actions and taunted his executioner to hurry up? Well, I think I found someone. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, also known as the Godfather of Matamoros. He was a serial killer who was a Mexican Palo Mayombe cult member who performed ritual torture and human sacrifices. Now, for those of you wondering what the hell Palo Mayombe is, it originated from the African Congo, and it is said to be the most powerful and feared form of black magic. There was a supposed number of 16 or more victims. The real number is unknown, however. The murders took place between 1986 and 1989. The victims were men, usually competing drug dealers, family members of drug dealers, and cult members. They were shot or stabbed with machetes. This took place in Mexico. And on May 6, 1989, after a police invasion, Constanzo ordered one of the disciples to shoot him and Quintana Rodriguez. They were both dead when the police finally broke in. Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida. His mother, Aurora Gonzalez, gave birth to him when she was 15 years old. She moved to San Juan, Puerto Rico, after her first husband died and remarried. While in San Juan, Constanzo was baptized Roman Catholic and even served as an altar boy. But he was also influenced by his mother's participation in Palo Mayombe. The family returned to Miami in 1972, and his stepfather died soon after, leaving the family with some money. His mother soon remarried, and his new stepfather was involved in the local drug trade and the occult. By that time, neighbors in Little Havana had begun to notice something odd about Aurora Constanzo and her son. Some say the woman was a witch, and those who angered her were likely to discover headless goats or chickens on their doorsteps in the morning. Adolfo's mother had introduced him to Santeria cult around age 9, with side trips from Puerto Rico to Haiti for instruction in voodoo. But there were still more secrets to be learned. And in 1976, he was apprenticed to a practitioner of Palomayambe. His occult godfather was already rich from working with local drug dealers, and he imparted a philosophy that would follow Adolfo to his grave. Let the non-believers kill themselves with drugs. We will profit from their foolishness. Around the same time, Constanzo's mother recalls that her oldest son began displaying psychic powers, scanning the future to predict such events as the 1981 shooting of President Ronald Reagan. Be that as it may, Adolfo had problems foretelling his own future, including 2 1981 arrests for shoplifting, one involving the theft of a chainsaw. On the side, he had also begun to display bisexual inclinations, with a strong preference for male lovers. A modeling assignment took the handsome young sorcerer to Mexico City in 1983, and he spent his free time telling fortunes with tarot cards in the city's infamous Zona Rosa. Before returning to Miami, Adolfo collected his first Mexican disciples, including Martin Quintana, homosexual psychic Jorge Montez, and Omar Orea, obsessed with the occult from age 15. In short order, Constanzo seduced both a young Latino Rodriguez and Orea, claiming one as his man and the other as his woman, depending on Adolfo's romantic whim. In mid-1984, Constanzo moved to Mexico City full-time, seeking what his mother called new horizons. He shared quarters with Quintana and Orea in a strange menage a trois, collecting other followers as his magic reputation spread throughout the city. It was said that Constanzo could read the future, and he also offered ritual cleansings for those who felt they had been cursed by enemies. Of course, it all cost money. In Constanzo's journals recovered after his death, document 31 regular customers, some paying up to $4,500 for a single ceremony. Adolfo established a menu for sacrificial beasts, with roosters going for $6 a head, goats for $30, boa constrictors at $450, adult zebras for $1,100, and African lion cubs listed at $3,100 each. True to the teachings of his Florida mentor, Constanzo went out of his way to charm wealthy drug dealers, helping them schedule shipments and meetings on the basis of his predictions. For a price, he offered magic that would make dealers and their hitmen invisible to police, bulletproof against their enemies. It was all nonsense, of course, but smugglers drawn from Mexican peasant stock with a background in Brujeria were strongly inclined to believe. According to Constanzo's ledgers, one dealer in Mexico City paid him $40,000 for magical services rendered over 3 years' time. At those rates, the customers demanded a show, and Constanzo recognized the folly of disappointing men who carried Uzi machine guns in their armor-plated limousines. Strong medicine required first-rate ingredients, and Adolfo was rolling by mid-1985 when he and 3 of his disciples raided a Mexico City graveyard for human bones to start his own Nganga, the traditional cauldron of blood employed by the practitioners of Palomayambe. The rituals and air of mystery surrounding Constanzo were powerful enough to lure a cross-section of Mexican society with his clique of disciples, including a physician, a real estate speculator, fashion models, and several transvestite nightclub performers. At first glance, the most peculiar aspect of Constanzo's new career was the appeal he seemed to have for ranking law enforcement officers. At least 4 members of the federal police joined Constanzo's cult in Mexico City. One of them, Salvador Garcia, was a commander in charge of narcotics investigations. Another, Florentino Ventura, retired from the federales to lead the Mexican branch of Interpol. In a country where bribery permeates all levels of law enforcement, and federal officers who sometimes serve as triggermen for drug smugglers, corruption is not unusual. But the devotion of Constanzo's followers ran deeper than cash on the line. In or out of uniform, they worshipped Adolfo as a minor god in his own right, their living conduit to the spirit world. In 1986, Florentino Ventura introduced Constanzo to the drug-dealing Calzada family, at the time one of Mexico's dominant narcotics cartels. Constanzo won the hard-nosed dealers over with his charm and mumbo-jumbo, profiting immensely from his contacts with the gang. By early 1987, he was able to pay $60,000 cash for a condominium in Mexico City, buying himself a fleet of luxury cars that also included an $80,000 Mercedes-Benz. When not working magic for the Calzadas families or other clients, Adolfo staged scams of his own, once posing as a DEA agent to rip off a coke dealer in Guadalajara, selling the stash through his police contacts for a cool $100,000. At some point in his odyssey from juvenile psychic to high society witch, Constanzo began to feed his Nganga with the offering of human sacrifice. There is no true final tally for his victims, but 23 ritual murders are well documented, and Mexican authorities point to a rash of unsolved mutilation slayings around Mexico City and elsewhere, suggesting that Constanzo's known victims may only represent the tip of a malignant iceberg. In any case, his willingness to torture and kill total strangers, along with close friends, duly impressed the ruthless drug dealers, who remained his foremost clients. In the course of a year's association, Constanzo came to believe that his magical powers alone were responsible for the Calzada family's continued success and survival. In April 1987, he demanded a full partnership in the syndicate and was curtly refused. On the surface, Constanzo seemed to take the rejection in stride, but his devious mind was working overtime, plotting revenge. On April 30th, Guillermo Calzada and 6 members of his household vanished under mysterious circumstances. They were reported missing on May 1st. Police noting melted candles and other evidence of a strange religious ceremony at the Calzada's office. 6 more days elapsed before officers began fishing mutilated remains from the Zumpango River. 7 corpses were recovered in the course of a week, all bearing marks of sadistic torture. Fingers, toes, and ears removed, hearts and sex organs excised, part of the spine ripped from one body, and 2 others missing their brains. The vanished parts, as it turned out, had gone to feed Constanzo's cauldron of blood, building up his strength for greater conquests yet to come. In July 1987, Salvador Garcia introduced Constanzo to another drug-running family, this one led by brothers Elio and Ovidio Hernandez. At the end of that month, in Matamoros, Constanzo had also met 22-year-old Sarah Aldrete, a Mexican national with resident alien status in the United States, where she attended college in Texas. Adolfo charmed Sarah with his line of patter, noting with arch significance that her birthday, September 6th, was the same as his mother's. Sarah was dating drug smuggler Gilberto Sosa at the time, but she soon wound up in Constanzo's bed. Adolfo scuttling the old relationship with an anonymous call to Sosa, revealing Sarah's infidelity. With nowhere else to turn, Sarah plunged full tilt into Constanzo's world, emerging as the madrina, the godmother or head witch of his cult, adding her own twists to the torture of sacrificial victims. Constanzo's rituals became more elaborate and sadistic after he moved his headquarters to a plot of desert called Rancho Santa Elena, 20 miles from Matamoros. There, on May 28, 1988, drug dealer Hector de la Fuente and farmer Moises Castillo were executed by gunfire. But the sacrifice was a disappointment to Constanzo. Back in Mexico City, he directed his drones to dismember a transvestite, Ramon Esquivel, and dump his grisly remains on a public street corner. His luck was holding, and Constanzo narrowly escaped when Houston police raided a drug house in June 1988, seizing numerous items of occult paraphernalia and the city's largest ever shipment of cocaine. On August 12th, Ovidio Hernandez and his 2-year-old son were kidnapped by rival narcotics dealers, the family turning to Constanzo for help. That night, another human sacrifice was staged at Rancho Santa Elena, and the hostages were released unharmed on August 13th, Adolfo claiming full credit for their safe return. His star was rising, and Constanzo barely noticed when Florentino Ventura committed suicide in Mexico City on September 17th, taking his wife and a friend with him in the same burst of gunfire. In November 1988, Constanzo sacrificed disciple Jorge Gomez, accused of snorting cocaine in direct violation of El Padrino's ban on drug use. A month later, Adolfo's ties with the Hernandez family were cemented with the initiation of Ovidio Hernandez as a full-fledged cultist, complete with ritual bloodletting and prayers to the Nganga. Human sacrifice can also have its practical side, as when competing smuggler Ezequiel Luna was tortured to death at Rancho Santa Elena on February 14, 1989. 2 other dealers, Ruben Garza and Ernesto Diaz, wandered into the ceremony uninvited and promptly wound up on the menu. Conversely, Adolfo sometimes demanded a sacrifice on the spur of the moment, without rhyme or reason. When he called for fresh meat on February 25th, Ovidio Hernandez gladly joined the hunting party, picking off his own 14-year-old cousin, Jose Garcia, in the heat of the moment. On March 13, 1989, Constanzo sacrificed yet another victim at the ranch, gravely disappointed when his prey did not scream and plead for mercy in the approved style. Disgruntled, he ordered for an Anglo for the next ritual, and his minions fanned out with their noses to the ground, abducting 21-year-old Mark Kilroy outside Matamoros Saloon. The sacrifice went well enough, followed 2 weeks later by the butchery of Sarah Aldrada's old boyfriend, Gilberto Sosa. But Kilroy's disappearance marked the beginning of the end for the Constanzo's homicidal family. A popular pre-med student from Texas, Mark Kilroy was not some peasant, transvestite, or small-time pusher who could disappear without a trace or an investigation into his fate. With family members and Texas politicians turning up the heat, the search for Kilroy rapidly assumed the trappings of an international incident. But it would be Constanzo's own disciples who would destroy him in the end. By late March 1989, Mexican authorities were busy with one of their own periodic anti-drug campaigns, erecting roadblocks on a whim and sweeping the border districts for unwary smugglers. On April 1st, Victor Sauceda, an ex-cop turned gangster, was sacrificed at the ranch, and the spirit message Constanzo received was optimistic enough for his troops to move a half-ton of marijuana across the border 7 nights later. And then the magic started to unravel. On April 9th, returning from a Texas meeting with Constanzo, cultist Serafin Hernandez drove past a police roadblock without stopping, ignoring the cars that set off in hot pursuit. Hernandez believed El Padrino's line about invisibility, and he seemed surprised when officers trailed him to his destination in Matamoros. Even so, the smuggler was arrogant, inviting police to shoot him, since the bullets would merely bounce off. They arrested him instead, along with cult member David Martinez, and drove the pair back to Rancho Santa Elena, where a preliminary search turned up marijuana and firearms. Disciples Elio Hernandez and Sergio Martinez stumbled into the net while police were on hand, and all 4 prisoners were interrogated through the evening, revealing their tales of black magic, torture, and human sacrifice, with a perverse kind of pride. The next morning, police returned to the ranch in force, discovering the shed where Constanzo kept his nanganga, brimming with blood, spiders, scorpions, a dead black cat, a turtle shell, bones, deer antlers, and a human brain. Captive cult members directed searchers to Constanzo's private cemetery, and excavation began, revealing 15 mutilated corpses by April 16th. In addition to Mark Kilroy and other victims already named, the body count included 2 renegade federal narcotics officers, Joaquin Manzo and Miguel Garcia, along with 3 other men who were never identified. The hunt for Constanzo was on, and police raided his luxury home outside Mexico City on April 17th, discovering stockpiles of gay pornography and a hidden ritual chamber. The discoveries at Rancho Santa Elena made international headlines, and sightings of Constanzo were reported as far away as Chicago, but in fact, he had already returned to Mexico City, hiding out in a small apartment with Sarah Aldrete and 3 other disciples. On May 2nd, thinking to save herself, Sarah tossed a note out the window. It read, "Please call the police and tell them that in this building are those they are seeking. Give them the address, 4th floor. Tell them that a woman is being held hostage. I beg for this, because what I want most is to talk, or they're going to kill the girl." A passerby found the note and kept it to himself, believing it to be someone's lame attempt at humor. On May 6th, neighbors called the police to complain of a loud, vulgar argument in Constanzo's apartment. Some say accompanied by gunshots. As patrolmen arrived on the scene, Constanzo opened fire with an Uzi, touching off a 45-minute battle in which, miraculously, only 1 policeman was wounded. When Constanzo realized that escape was impossible, he handed his weapon to cultist Alvaro de Leon Valdez, a professional hitman nicknamed El Dubi. with bizarre new orders. El Duby recalls the scene. He told me to kill him and Martin. I told him I couldn't do it, but he hit me in the face and threatened me that everything would go bad for me in hell. Then he hugged Martin, and I just stood in front of them and shot them with a machine gun. Constanzo and Quintana were dead when police stormed the apartment, arresting El Duby and Sarah Aldrete. In the aftermath of the raid, 14 cultists were indicted on various charges, including multiple murder, weapons and narcotics violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. In August 1990, El Duby was convicted of killing Constanzo and Quintana, drawing a 30-year prison term. Cultists Juan Fragosa and Jorge Montes were both convicted in the Ramon Esquivel murder and sentenced to 35 years each. Omar Orea, convicted in the same case, died of AIDS before he could be sentenced. Sarah Aldrete was acquitted of Constanzo's murder, but sentenced to a 6-year term on conviction of criminal association. She was nearing the end of that sentence in 1994 when her long-delayed trial on multiple murder charges brought another conviction and a 60-year prison term. Police in Mexico are still uncertain of Constanzo's final body count, some officers trying to clear every ritualistic murder on the books by blaming Constanzo. On the other hand, in June 1989, Martin Quintana's sister told police that Adolfo's first madrina was still at large, practicing her blood magic in Guadalajara. And from jail before he died, Omar Orea said, "I don't think that the religion will end with us, because it has a lot of people in it. They have found a temple in Monterrey that isn't even related to us. It will continue." Haunting words from someone whose magic couldn't save him or his associates from their crimes. Black magic and voodoo practices are nothing new, and it seems Adolfo Constanzo's future was doomed from the start. Keeping the dark arts in the dark is what lures those who are unaware of them right into their trap. So by putting it in the light, we might prevent those innocently wanting a better life not to be enticed by the promises of those like Constanzo, who have nothing to offer but a life of utter darkness. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please contact me through any of my social media links or email me at duchessdark676@gmail.com. See you next time. Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday Unsolved series. We venture into this new subcategory in an attempt to explore the theories and possibilities of the unsolved case of the Zodiac Killer. In December of 1968 until October of 1969, 4 men and 3 women between the ages of 16 and 29 were targeted. The killer claimed to have killed 37 victims, but only 5 deaths were ever confirmed. The killer originated the name Zodiac in a series of taunting letters sent to the local Bay Area press. These letters included 4 cryptograms or ciphers. The site ZodiacKiller.com has dedicated themselves to cracking the code of the Zodiac and even has each letter posted and broken down for you to read. I have left a link in the description box if you'd like to check it out for yourself. The first murders widely attributed to the Zodiac Killer were the shootings of high school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday on December 20th, 1968. On Lake Herman Road just inside Benicia city limits. The couple were on their first date and planned to attend a Christmas concert at Hogan High School about 3 blocks from Jensen's home. The couple instead visited a friend before stopping at a local restaurant and then driving out on Lake Herman Road. At about 10:15 p.m., Faraday parked his mother's Rambler in a gravel turnout, which was a well-known lover's lane. Shortly after 11 p.m., their bodies were discovered by Stella Borges, who lived nearby. The Solano County Sheriff's Department investigated the crime, but no leads developed. Utilizing available forensic data, Robert Graysmith postulated that another car pulled into the turnout just prior to 11 p.m. and parked beside the couple. The killer apparently exited the second car and walked toward the Rambler, possibly ordering the couple out of the Rambler. Jensen appeared to have exited the car first, yet when Faraday was halfway out, the killer apparently shot Faraday in the head. Fleeing from the killer, Jensen was gunned down 28 feet from the car with 5 shots through her back. The killer then drove off. Just before midnight on July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron and Michael McGow drove into the Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, 4 miles from the Lake Herman Road murder site, and parked. While the couple sat in Farron's car, a second car drove into the lot and parked alongside them, but almost immediately drove away. Returning 10 minutes later, this second car parked behind them. The driver of the second car then exited the vehicle, approaching the passenger side door of Farron's car, carrying a flashlight and a 9mm Luger. The killer directed the flashlight into McGow's and Farron's eyes before shooting at them, firing 5 times. Both victims were hit, and several bullets had passed through McGow and into Farron. The killer walked away from the car, but upon hearing McGow's moaning, returned and shot each victim twice more before driving off. On July 5th, 1969 at 12:40 a.m., a man phoned the Vallejo Police Department to report and claim responsibility for the attack. The killer also took credit for the murders of Jensen and Faraday 6.5 months earlier. The police traced the call to a phone booth at a gas station about 3/10 of a mile from Farron's home, and only a few blocks from the Vallejo Police Department. Farron was pronounced dead at the hospital. McGow survived the attack despite being shot in the face, neck, and chest. On August 1st, 1969, 3 letters prepared by the killer were received at the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. The nearly identical letters took credit for the shootings at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. Each letter also included 1/3 of a 408 symbol cryptogram, which the killer claimed contained his identity. The killer demanded they be printed on each newspaper's front page, or he would cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again, until I end up with 12 people over the weekend. The following is the letter deciphered. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and those that I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow me down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. The Chronicle published its third of the cryptogram on page 4 of the next day's edition. An article printed alongside the code quoted Vallejo police chief as saying, "We're not satisfied that the letter was written by the murderer," and requested the writer send a second letter with more facts to prove his identity. The threatened murders did not happen, and all 3 parts of the letter were eventually published. On August 7, 1969, another letter was received at the San Francisco Examiner with the salutation, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." This was the first time the killer had used his name for identification. The letter was a response to Chief Stiltz's request for more details that would prove he had killed Faraday, Jensen, and Farron. In it, the Zodiac included details about the murders which had not yet been released to the public, as well as a message to the police that when they cracked his code, they will have me. On August 8, 1969, Donald and Betty Hardin of Salinas, California, cracked the 408-symbol cryptogram. It contained a misspelled message in which the killer said he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. No name appears in the decoded text, and the killer said that he would not give away his identity because it would slow him down. On September 27, 1969, Pacific Union College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking at Lake Berryessa. A man approached them wearing a black executioner's-type hood with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes and a bib-like device on his chest. It had a white 3x3 cross-circle symbol on it. He approached them with a gun, which Hartnell believed to be a .45. The hooded man claimed to be an escaped convict from Deer Lodge, Montana, where he had killed a guard and stolen a car, explaining that he needed their car and money to go to Mexico. He had brought pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline and told Shepard to tie up Hartnell before he tied her up. The killer checked and tightened Hartnell's bonds after discovering Shepard had bound Hartnell's hands loosely. Hartnell initially believed it to be a weird robbery, but the man drew a knife and stabbed them both repeatedly. The killer then hiked 500 yards back up to Knoxville Road, drew the cross-circle symbol on Hartnell's car door with a black felt-tip pen, and wrote beneath it the dates of each murders. At 7:40 p.m., the killer called the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone to report his latest crime. The phone was found, still off the hook, minutes later at the Napa Car Wash on Main Street in Napa, by radio reporter Pat Stanley, only a few blocks from the sheriff's office, yet 27 miles from the crime scene. Detectives were able to lift a still wet palm print from the telephone, but were never able to find a match. After hearing their screams for help, a man and his son, who were fishing in a nearby cove, discovered the victims and summoned help by contacting park rangers. Napa County Sheriff Deputies Dave Collins and Ray Land were the first law enforcement officers to arrive at the crime scene. Cecilia Shepard was conscious when Collins arrived, providing him with a detailed description of the attacker. Hartnell and Shepard were taken to Queen of Valley Hospital in Napa by ambulance. Shepard lapsed into a coma during the transport and never regained consciousness. She died 2 days later, but Hartnell survived to recount his tale to the press. Napa County Sheriff Detective Ken Narlow, who was assigned to the case from the outset, worked on solving the crime until his retirement from the department in 1987. October 11, 1969. A passenger entered the cab driven by Paul Stein, 1 block west from Union Square in San Francisco, requesting to be taken to Presidio Heights. For reasons unknown, Stein drove 1 block past the requested destination. The passenger then shot Stein once in the head with a 9mm, took Stein's wallet and car keys, and tore away a section of Stein's blood-stained shirt tail. The passenger was observed by 3 teenagers across the street at 9:55 p.m. They called the police while the crime was in progress. They observed a man wiping the cab down before walking away towards Presidio, 1 block to the north. 2 blocks from the crime scene, Officer Don Falk, responding to the call, observed a white man walking along the sidewalk and stepping onto a stairway leading up to the front yard of one of the homes on the north side of the street. The encounter lasted only 5 to 10 seconds. The radio dispatcher had alerted to be on the lookout for a black suspect, so they drove past him without stopping. The mix-up in descriptions remains unexplained to this day. A search ensued, but no possible suspects were found. The 3 teen witnesses worked with a police artist to prepare a composite sketch of Stein's killer. Over the years, the San Francisco Police Department investigated an estimated 2,500 suspects. On October 14, 1969, the Chronicle received another letter from the Zodiac, this time containing a swatch of Paul Stein's shirt tail as proof he was the killer. It also included a threat about killing school children on a school bus. To do this, Zodiac wrote, "Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." At 2 p.m. on October 20th, 1969, someone claiming to be the Zodiac called Oakland PD demanding that one of the 2 prominent lawyers, F. Lee Bailey or Melvin Belly, appear on the local television show AM San Francisco, hosted by Jim Dunbar. Bailey was not available, but Belly did appear on the show. Dunbar appealed to the viewers to keep the lines open, and eventually, someone claiming to be the Zodiac called several times and said his name was Sam. Belly agreed to meet with him in Daly City, but the suspect never showed. On November 8, 1969, the Zodiac mailed a card with another cryptogram consisting of 340 characters. Only recently has this cryptogram been deciphered by thezodiackiller.com. On November 9, 1969, the Zodiac mailed a 7-page letter stating that 2 policemen stopped and actually spoke with him 3 minutes after he shot Stein. On December 20th, 1969, exactly 1 year after the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, the Zodiac mailed a letter to Belly that included another swatch of Stein's shirt. The Zodiac said he wanted Belly to help him. On the night of March 22, 1970, Kathleen Johns was driving from San Bernardino to Petaluma to visit her mother. She was 7 months pregnant and had her 10-month-old daughter beside her. While heading west on Highway 132 near Modesto, a car behind her began honking its horn and flashing its headlights. She pulled off the road and stopped. The man in the car behind parked and approached her, stating that he observed that her right rear wheel was wobbling and offered to tighten the lug nuts. After finishing his work, the man drove off. Yet when Johns pulled forward to re-enter the highway, the wheel almost immediately came off the car. The man returned, offering to drive her to the nearest gas station for help. She and her daughter climbed into his car. During the ride, the car passed several service stations, but the man did not stop. For about 90 minutes, he drove back and forth around the back roads. When Johns asked why he was not stopping, he would change the subject. When the driver finally stopped at an intersection, Johns jumped out with her daughter and hid in a field. The driver searched for her using his flashlight, telling her that he would not hurt her, before eventually giving up. Unable to find her, he got back into a car and drove off. Johns hitched a ride to the police station in Patterson. When Johns gave her statement to the sergeant on duty, she noticed the police composite sketch of Paul Stein's killer and recognized him as the driver. Fearing he might come back and kill them all, the sergeant had Johns wait in the dark at the nearby Mills restaurant. When her car was found, it had been gutted and torched. The Zodiac continued to communicate with authorities for the remainder of 1970 via letters and greeting cards to the press. In a letter postmarked April 20th, 1970, the Zodiac wrote, "My name is," followed by a 13-character cipher. The Zodiac went on to state that he was not responsible for the recent bombing of a police station in San Francisco, but added, "There is more glory to killing a cop, because a cop can shoot back." The letter included a diagram of a bomb that the Zodiac claimed he would use to blow up a school bus, and at the bottom of the diagram he wrote, "Zodiac Killer 10, SFPD 0. The Zodiac sent a greeting card postmarked April 28, 1970 to the Chronicle. Written on the card was, "I hope you enjoy yourselves when I have my blast," followed by the Zodiac's cross-circle signature. On the back of the card, the Zodiac threatened to use the bus bomb soon unless the newspaper published the full details he wrote. He also wanted to start seeing people wearing some nice Zodiac buttons. In a letter postmarked June 26, 1970, the Zodiac stated he was upset that he did not see people wearing Zodiac buttons. He wrote, "I shot a man sitting in a parked car with a .38, possibly referring to the murder of Sergeant Richard Reditic a week earlier. On June 19th at 5:25 a.m., Reditic was writing a parking ticket in his squad car when an assailant shot him in the head with a .38. Reditic died 15 hours later. SFPD denies the Zodiac was involved in his murder. However, it remains unsolved. Included in the same letter was a Phillips 66 road map of the San Francisco Bay Area. On the image of Mount Diablo, the Zodiac had drawn a cross circle similar to the ones he had included in previous correspondence. At the top of the cross circle, he placed a 0, 3, 6, and 9. The accompanying instructions stated that the 0 was to be set to Mag N. The letter also included a 32-letter cipher that the killer claimed would, in conjunction with the code, lead to the location of a bomb he had buried and set to go off in the fall. The cipher was never decoded, and the alleged bomb was never located. The killer signed the note with Zodiac Killer 12, SFPD 0. In a letter to the Chronicle postmarked July 24, 1970, the Zodiac took credit for Kathleen John's abduction 4 months after the incident. In a July 26th letter, the Zodiac paraphrased a song from the Mikado, adding his own lyrics about making a little list of the ways he planned to torture his slaves in paradise. The letter was signed with a large and exaggerated cross-circle symbol with a new score, Zodiac Killer 13, SFPD 0. A final note at the bottom of the letter stated, P.S. The Mount Diablo code concerns radians and inches along the radians. In 1981, a close examination of the radian hint by Zodiac researcher Gareth Penn led to the discovery that a radian angle, when placed over the map per Zodiac's instructions, pointed to 2 of the locations of the Zodiac attacks. On October 7, 1970, the Chronicle received a 3x5-inch card signed by the Zodiac, with the Zodiac Killer symbol and a small cross reportedly drawn in blood. The card's message was formed by pasting words and letters from an edition from the Chronicle. 13 holes were punched across the card, and inspectors agreed it was highly probable the card came from the Zodiac. On October 27, 1970, Chronicle reporter Paul Avery, who had been covering the Zodiac case, received a Halloween card signed with the letter Z and the Zodiac's cross-circle symbol. Handwritten on the card was the note, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." The threat was taken seriously and received a